Welcome. Over the last many years, me and Robin have actually recorded a number of interviews. But today we're going to be exploring AI takeoff scenarios with reference to a previous debate, an AI Foom debate with Eliezer Yudkowsky that happened many years ago on a series of blog posts and video as well. So there's plenty of food for thought. That's it,
Ha ha.
Okay, so Robin Hanson is Associate Professor at George Mason University and Research Associate at Future of Humanity Institute, Oxford, and is also a blogger at Overcoming Bias, which has been extremely influential, I must say, over the many years in many areas on heuristics and biases, futurology, strategic forecasting, economics, and a whole lot more. And it's also where I believe Les Ron was born. So Robin is the author of two books, The Age of M. Yes, right there. That's the elephant in the brain. And there must be a copy of Age of M somewhere. There it is. Yep, great covers both. Yeah, and actually both of which we have discussed in previous interviews. So a warm welcome back to Robin Hanson. Many thanks for joining us again.
It's great to be here. Do you mind if I set a stage?
You can.
All right. Well, I'll set the stage with Bond villains. You see, so if you've seen the classic James Bond movies, they tend to have a villain, and often the villain has a secret island somewhere where he has a secret set of henchmen who have been developing technology. And this technology is often competitive with huge nation states technologies, even though there seems to be only a few dozen people there. And this is a tradition that goes way back in science fiction of some small group developing this powerful technology that rivals the major industries and nations of the world. So even say 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea imagines a small group of sailors who go off to form their own island, and they develop nuclear-powered submarines and nuclear weapons and a whole underwater cities, all impressive technology far beyond what nations and industries of the time can do. And in many people's minds, this is a plausible thing. It's because in their minds, I think, technology is very lumpy. There's just a small number of major technological innovations that happen. And if you have one of those, why, you have this leap forward and you can go well beyond lots of other people in an area. And in people's minds, they don't see technology as having that many parts. And so they see, the history of technology, and maybe there's 12 things that ever happened or something. And so if you get one of those 12 things, why, you leap far ahead of others. This is how a lot of people see technology. They see it concentrated in this one invention, and a big, broad invention that has enormous impact, and that all the other smaller inventions and all the other development and all the other details about making it work in particular context is of minor importance relative to the grand invention. This is the narrative we've been telling people for a long time about technology, is that there are these few genius inventors, and they make these brilliant inventions, and that's most of everything that matters. Mm-hmm. Even when people worry, say, about capitalism or what will happen with the trends of technology, they tend to imagine it's relatively easy for, say, one firm to take over the world. Mm-hmm. One company buys up all the other companies, and it makes everything itself, and it has its market power, and it controls everything, and this is a terrible outcome. And Marx and Engels long ago predicted in their communist predictions that this would be the inevitable result of capitalism. More and more concentration into a smaller number of firms who had more and more market power, who crushed the life out of the workers and forced them to be immiserated and took over nations and ran the world by having this huge concentration of power. And in many people's minds, that's just a plausible direction capitalism would go. It's just what would naturally happen if regulators weren't there to stop it. And so if in your mind these seem like plausible scenarios, then something like the standard AI Foom scenario seems plausible too, I would say, because it's a similar sort of scenario. So the standard AI Foom scenario, of which this debate was about, was the scenario that we've all been working on AI for years now, but we've been making slow, difficult progress. But at some point, some small team somewhere has the one big invention, the one huge insight.
Mm-hmm.
That allows this small team to make vast progress compared to not only the other teams are around, but the entire rest of the world.
Mm.
And so this AI, now this team is able to make such rapid progress that they whoosh past all the milestones that we see ahead of us, past human level AI, past cheap human level AI to super intelligence. And this small team therefore has this super intelligent machine, which they may or may not have control of. And they therefore rule the world. And this could happen not only in any short time, like a year, but maybe in a month or a weekend.
Mm. Okay, so like a supervillain surrounded by minions in similarly colored jumpsuits.
Yeah, something like that.
They look very suspicious, especially in the movie. So.
Right. So if you thought the villain, the James Bond villain having his super weapons on his little island was plausible, and you thought one from taking over the world was plausible, then you might think it's plausible that there's this one super invention that makes a small team able to basically take over the world.
Right.
And so the whole question is how plausible is that? Sorry, go ahead.
This one team, like isolated in an island somewhere, does it have access to the internet? I mean, can it download a whole heap of modules and just make the right adjustments and put them together in the same way as maybe a team in a bunker in Silicon Valley somewhere could do?
This has often been one of the hypothesized advantages of the James Bond villain team, is that they can read the world's newspapers and the world's scientific journals, and they're getting all the advantage of other people's developments, but they're not sharing in reverse. So people imagine there's this advantage from being secret, where other people are at a disadvantage relative to you if your project is small and secret, and theirs is not.
So I mean, we have a skunkworks supervillain trying to develop super intelligence, and we better hope that doesn't work, because we don't want a supervillain directing the values of super intelligence.
Right. So, one thing to say is, what if we just assume this scenario is possible? And then we might say, well, yeah, sure. If this scenario is possible, then you might want to fill the world with some designs that when the supervillain team makes their supervillain project, and they are trying to be a little careful, there are some safety guidelines that they can pick up and follow that will make their project a little safer. So at least their machine doesn't get out of their control. And so we are only under the rule and world rule of this supervillain team and not their supervillain robot. So that's sure, obviously. And under this scenario, the key point is it's very unpredictable when it might happen. And therefore, you got to be working on this way ahead of time. You can't tell when it's going to happen. You can't tell when you're close by assumption here, because this development these lumpy developments are just very hard to predict. They're very random. They don't come with much warning. And they're so huge that, of course, if one of these things is coming, you would need to be working ahead of time well before it seems like you might be needed, because you don't know when you'll be needed, and you'll be wanting to work out ways to help these people keep their machine under control. The supervillain small island team. And of course, we'll also should say it's not a zero probability. I'm not going to argue that this is a zero probability scenario. And so you might say, well, no matter how small the probability, if the danger is high enough, well, it should justify substantial effort. And I might say, okay, somebody out there somewhere should be working on that. Fine, that's okay with me. So my complaint will come in and talking about, well, how many people? How big does this sort of scenario loom in people's minds relative to other scenarios, and what fraction of the resources are going into focusing on that scenario relative to other scenarios? That's where I'll make my complaint and disagreement. But I'm not gonna say it's impossible. I'm not gonna say nobody should be working on it.
I get that, but I'm sure this is not the sort of characterization someone would make if they were trying to steel man the other side's arguments. So I mean, like, I guess you've also written about things in the past which seem quite close to some of the arguments of others regarding general progress. One of them was this constraint elasticity of substitution, where you have three exponential growth curves or growth modes. Hunting, which is substituted by farming, which is substituted by industry, and at some stage will be substituted by something else, weakly suggesting that within a century, a new mode might appear with a doubling time measured in days and not years. Others have suggested this could be AI. This is your writing. Okay, right. I was just quoting. But that was written in 2000, I think, yeah. But others have suggested this mode would be AI. And you could suggest that there could be like an M sort of thing.
Right. So more context then. First of all, we have data on the lumpiness of innovation in the past. We even have good citation data. That is how many scientific papers get how many citations. And it's basically a power law sort of thing. And so there are, every once in a while, a few big lumpy innovations. And so that is part of the distribution of innovation. Most innovation, in terms of an integral sense, is in the many small ones, but every once in a while there's a big innovation. And if we look back in history and we ask, what were the biggest things that ever happened in all of history? The biggest things that ever happened seem to have been innovations that caused the entire world growth rate to increase by factors of 50 to 200. Now, right. There's maybe only 3 or 4 of those that we are somewhat confident actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's not very many, but they did happen. So it's important to say history can be roughly summarized as modes where growth was exponential. It was doubling at a certain rate. And then it reached a critical point where within less than a doubling time, the doubling time increased by a factor of 50 or more. And so examples of that were the introduction of humans,
mm-hmm.
The introduction of farming,
yes,
and the introduction of industry, and maybe some things even earlier than humans, but at least those 3 cases. It looks like there was something happened that made the growth rate go up by a factor of 50 or more. So, and if you look at the statistics of these things, you can say these previous modes each encompassed roughly a similar number of doublings, and the rate, the factor by which the doublings increased was comparable. And so you can put those 2 things together to say, well, we would roughly predict sometime in roughly the next century or so, there'd be a transition where the growth rate would go up within a less than, say, our 15-year doubling time, and that the new doubling time might be, say, a month or even more, even faster. So it's not crazy to think with sometime in the next century or so, there would be a short period, say less than 15 years, during which we would transition from our current economy doubling every 15 years to a new economy doubling every month. And that's a pretty dramatic prediction. So if you want to call that Foom, I'm okay with that, or a singularity. But the key distinction I'd make is that these previous transitions were sort of the whole world growing faster. It was concentrated somewhat in subsets of the world, but it wasn't one island or one machine in a base, one tiny group. These were large chunks of the world together that found a way to grow faster. And so that would be
in the case of industry, and the case of, if you would argue, the beginning of the scientific method, that did seem to start in a very small place in the world, like namely England, for instance.
Well, there's locating the causal events on the path to producing it, and there's encompassing most of the change. So even if, say, the Industrial Revolution could be thought of as starting in Manchester in the late 1700s, and you could identify a thing that happened there that was interestingly different. Manchester wasn't doubling every 15 years. England and Northern Europe together started growing faster together, and then their various colonies that were selling to them contributed to that. And so it was really a big chunk of the world that grew together. and accelerated its growth until it really started hitting the stride of, as I say, now doubling every 15 years. Even if you can identify a place where it especially seemed to have originated, that's not the place that took most of the advantage. So that might be like saying that some group was the first AI team to develop some new technique and to publish a paper on it and have an exciting development, but that doesn't mean it's going to be the only team that uses that development and the only team that's part of the new economic growth that's based on it. You could still have a much wider, group of firms and cities and nations that are taking advantage of it and growing together.
Sure. But just at this stage, for anybody who doesn't understand or who isn't familiar with some of the terminology, there's a couple of kinds of takeoffs. There's a soft takeoff, which is years or decades. That's the time frames where people usually refer to soft takeoff as being. And then a hard takeoff. This is also referred to as the Foom. That could be minutes, days, or months, right? Is that what do you agree with those time frames?
Again, I'm not that picky about the words. I would focus on the key distinction of the locality. That is, how small a chunk of the world is it that's encompassing most of this change and growth? That chunk of the world was a pretty large chunk for the Industrial Revolution. It was also a pretty large chunk for the Farming Revolution. Although perhaps a smaller chunk, and even it seems a smaller chunk for the initial human revolution. That is, most of the gains seem to have been encompassed within the human species, and there were a number of other proto-human species that were existing in parallel, and they, in the end, gained relatively little from.
You could argue that the world gets smaller because it's becoming the network bandwidth is getting wider between various geographical places around the world.
Well, I have in fact
distributed innovations can certainly be sort of picked up almost instantaneously by various parties around the world.
Right. So I'd say there's two big effects that so far have determined how small a fraction of the world it was that encompassed the new revolution. One was the degree of information sharing and copying. So species found it difficult to share information with each other. It was mostly genetic, and that was relatively limited. So that meant mostly some species just won over other species. Whereas with farming, it seems to be, say, the literature I remember, roughly 50-50. It was farmers displacing other foragers versus foragers copying the behaviors of the new farmers as farming spread across the world. And so, and with the Industrial Revolution, it was even more that Manchester by itself couldn't do that much because it was part of this interdependent economy. Not only were other parts of the world economy copying Manchester, but they were complementing. So once you have a world economy that different places specialize, then when one place has a big advantage in the thing it specializes in, that actually produces a big advantage for everybody else who complements that. So if you're making machine tools in Manchester, that's great. But if you need cotton from the US, or if you need, tea from China, or if you need wheat from the Netherlands, whatever else you need to make your economy go, all those other things are increasing in value as you make your machine tools more valuable as well. And so there's this standard economics effect of complementing different, if there's many things that need to work together, any one of them being more valuable makes all the other ones more valuable.
Yeah, I guess for me, I find it difficult to know whether it really supports one side of the argument there. Yeah, I mean, like you don't think that services are lumpy or likely to be lumpy. There's less chances of these, a big clump of AI services suddenly just taking off and being really effective in one part of the world. But does geographical location or even like logical industry location matter all that much if there's so much of the tools that are out there being shared. The only big difference now is the people just, there may need to be some more research and new tools created, but a lot of it may be just putting together things that already exist.
Well, again, the key idea is if to do everything we need doing, we have lots of different parts. Then when you improve one part, that's great, but then you increase the demand for all the other parts. So, if you found a way to mow lawns vastly better, then everybody, can mow their lawns much more cheaply. But now, because that's cheaper, they spend their resources on other things, and there's the increased demand for everything else in the economy because the economy is now richer because there's one thing that previously was expensive and now is very cheap. And so it's about how many different things are there that all need to be done. And so this comes to a point of people imagining this future AI. A key question about future AI is basically, how many parts does it have? If there was just the one AI part, and when you improve that one part, basically it could do everything better, well, then you don't need any other parts, right? It's all you need. In which case, whoever can make that thing, owns everything. In the same way that, if the Industrial Revolution, if there was one super machine you could make that would do everything that an industrial economy needed, well, whoever could have made that one super machine would have taken over the world economy because everybody would have wanted that one machine. And if they couldn't copy it easy and had to buy it from this one firm that sold the one super machine, well, then that one firm and the one city that encompassed it could plausibly have taken over the world. But now that we look back on industry, we think it's kind of silly to imagine one super machine. We understand that machines are valuable, but you need different machines to do different things. And so no one company or city took over all the machines and all possible machines. They took over particular machines. There was the cities that made cars, and there's the cities that made building materials, and there's the cities that made telephones, and these were all different machines. And they were made in different places by different companies and different specialists. And so even though they're all part of the industrial economy, there isn't one firm that took over industry. And so the quick question about that in this future AI is AI like that or not? And that's the subject, in essence, of this book-length technical report that Eric Drexler posted.
Yeah.
Of thinking of AI as services. And so his vision is that in the future, when you have these very capable systems, they are composed of many subsystems, and each subsystem provides a service. It does a particular thing. It translates, or it designs a circuit, or it makes a map planning program, and it provides that service. And if the entire if together all these future AI services can do basically most anything you want really cheaply, then we are in the world of advanced AI where it outcompetes humans. But there doesn't have to be any one part of that has a big percentage control or effect. It could be thousands of these little services that together produce the whole effect, in which case you should worry less that any one of these services will suddenly take over the world. It's not a plausible thing, he argues. And I agree that under the assumption that AI services naturally breaks into thousands of little services, each of which is relatively narrow and specialized. So I might think, imagine a pallet loader, something that basically takes pallets off a truck and puts them in the warehouse or vice versa. Imagine a super duper, really good pallet loader. It's really good at pallet loading. Do you have to worry about the pallet loader taking over the universe? Well, not so much if its job is constrained to pallet loading. If you say, hey, pallet loader, here's $1 billion, do whatever you want and make my world better. Well, now maybe you should worry a bit because you've given this open-ended broad task. But if you keep it with the pretty narrow task of pallet loading, there's not so much to worry about. So a key question then is, under this scenario, the counter argument could be, well, there are some lumpy tasks. AI doesn't just break into 1,000 little narrow tasks. There is a few core uber tasks that just a bunch of important things all have to be done together. There's just no way to disentangle them. And that part just is really dangerous. That thing, if whatever it does is capable of doing lots of other things, and you should be really careful about what powers you give that.
Right. And on the subject of applying optimization power to achieve something, there's a difference between an optimization power being focused on, growing strong claws or focusing on, a mouth that's really good for biting. But what distinguished humans amongst other animals who you can argue their body design was focusing on predation and giving them large muscles, big claws, and very sharp teeth. With humans, I guess the optimization power in relative to other species was focused on the brain. If one of these tasks that Drexler's distributed AGI was focusing on was actually creating intelligence and not just like a surface, like, having sharp scalpels or creating great microwave ovens or, making cars, then yeah, that could, that could also be an argument that an intelligence explosion could come from Eric Drexler's view. And I'm not sure either. You're in contact with Eric at the Future of Humanity Institute, I guess. You must have spoken to him. Does he think that's the only probable scenario that he sees on the horizon, or is it he just framing it as one of the possible scenarios?
I mean, it's just clear from his writing that he thinks it's relatively likely and even more recommended. That is, you should be trying to push toward this scenario. It's a safer scenario, and he doesn't see that much of a loss from pushing this scenario. It looks like.
Yes, I wasn't arguing whether he thought it was a good idea, but whether he thought that on balance it was far more probable than an intelligence explosion or a fast takeoff, a la Foom.
So as you indicated, this people's views on the lumpiness of AI and on the lumpiness of AI innovation is related to their views on the lumpiness of human brains. Two related points are, what explains the time trajectory of human advancement? That is, was there a single lumpy innovation that happened at a particular time that explains a discontinuity in human history? And inside the brain, is there some key algorithm that's a lumpy algorithm in the sense that there'd be a time when it was developed and a time before it was developed, and then when you add that algorithm, then that's the thing that gives humans its broad general capability. That's a question about the human brain. You could argue either way, and so we can go into both of these details if you'd like. On the human history, it seems relatively clear that there was this discontinuity in the growth rate, as we talked about. That is, humans, and the key cause of that discontinuity was cultural evolution. That seems to be a relatively strong consensus. That is, animals before humans, when they had an innovation, it had to be embodied in their genes, and so they had to share their genes to share that innovation. And humans pioneered a much stronger level of cultural innovation, which is that a human could invent a new behavior and then transmit it culturally so that other people would copy it visually, hear words, and repeat and try. And it was sufficient to get a new behavior transferred to other people without needing to go through the genes. And that's the key thing that allowed human innovation rates to be much faster than other animals. So there was this key discontinuity, and we understand that that was the cause. And so if there's a lumpiness in the human brain with respect to that discontinuity, it's about a lumpiness with respect to cultural evolution. What is the basis for cultural evolution in the human brain?
Well, I guess there's a limitation in the computing power. If humans were, 10,000 times as intelligent, and then suddenly stumbled upon like tools, then there would be less need for there to be a distributed sort of innovation. Innovations could happen at the speed of thought in you know, a super intelligent brain, but it didn't happen that way. I mean, we're cognitively limited, skull bound, right. And so we need to distribute innovation across a wide variety of people in a, yeah.
So actually, it seems like the last three and maybe more of these major transitions in history were caused by improvements in the diffusion or distribution of innovation. And so that seems to be the consistent cause so far of these leaps in innovation. And so again, the key thing is there were these three major changes at least that happened. And we can look at each one and ask what caused that. And they are somewhat lumpy in the sense that there's a time before and after, and there's this huge effect of this innovation. But the effect is in the growth rate, not in the level of ability. These aren't innovations that make the systems suddenly more capable, except in the capability of sharing innovation. That's the key capability that made the difference before and after these innovations. So they aren't things that let you think better or something in just some absolute sense. They are things that let you learn faster.
I find that a bit confusing, because without good language, without modern language, without a more articulate form of language, and it seems difficult to be able to scaffold some of the concepts that we talk about today. So the invention of numbers and systems of I guess symbolizing.
So when you say history is summarized as these three huge innovations that changed growth rates, you'll realize that's surprising when you think about all the other things that happened that did not change the growth rate. So for example, the invention of writing seems like it's this very potent invention that certainly should have had a big effect, and yet apparently it didn't. The invention of writing was not corresponding to some big innovation in the growth rate. And of course, our history books are full of dozens, at least, of other really huge things that were invented. But this story says, no, there were only ever three big inventions. And every other invention was something that allowed the current growth mode to continue, but it wasn't something that changed the growth rate of the mode. So for example, computers showed up during the Industrial Revolution, but they did not change the growth rate of the Industrial Revolution. The industry economy has been doubling roughly every 15 years, and that was true before and after computers. So while computers are a terribly important innovation, they have allowed us to continue at the previous growth rate. And of course, the economy can't double every 15 years unless a lot of innovations are big and happen. But that's not the same as changing the rate of innovation. And so
language was more of an enabler for the growth mode to continue in that sort of trajectory rather than turning it up.
Well, I mean, for many of these, it's not entirely clear what the most local driver was. So for the human revolution and the farming revolution and the industrial revolution, we have a better sense of the key effect, but what was the proximate cause that triggered it is less clear. And for many of these things, we don't quite have the timing. So we don't really have a good timing on language. So, language is still in the ballpark as a plausible explanation for what caused the key human cultural revolution. I'm on balance, I wouldn't quite believe it, but it's not crazy. And similarly with farming, you might say, writing showed up near enough to farming that might have thought it could have been until you look at the details, but farming really got started well before writing. And so writing didn't seem to have made that big a difference, but there's still this key question, well, what caused the key difference of farming?
And writing was come from it early on. Did the printing press make a big difference, do you think?
Well, the printing press is obviously more nearer the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution starts to get going a few centuries ago. And there's a number of interesting things that happen within a few centuries in the Industrial Revolution that are all candidates for perhaps the key thing that triggered the cascade of events that led to the Industrial Revolution. But it does seem, to me at least, the key thing in the Industrial Revolution was a new way to diffuse innovations through networks of experts, analogous to scientific societies, though not always exactly equal to. In the ancient world, innovation was mostly diffused through artifacts and animals and plants, but not so much through networks of experts. It wasn't like the expert in pig farming in Russia talked to the expert in pig farming in France and passed the pig innovation that way. It was just more the pigs themselves moved, and pig farmers along the way took them and moved them. And so, and it does seem like the farming world has the possibility of faster innovation because of the stable location and trading and war networks. So most foragers are actually not very close to very many other foragers. They don't interact with that much, and they don't do much trading or war. And so it's hard to actually diffuse innovation through foragers, because it's not like there's these long distance networks whereby you trade with the necktie and they trade, etc. That's not how it happened with foragers, but that's how it does happen with farmers. So it does seem like a plausible explanation for the higher rate of innovation of farming is that they are now dense enough to have long distance networks of trading and war. Basically, they are dense enough to stay in one spot. When you're in one spot, it's much easier to find you, and you're denser, and so you're closer. And so again, our best explanation for each of these major things that happen in history is a change in the rate of diffusion of innovation. Not necessarily the rate of invention, but how quickly they spread, or not even necessarily in being smarter in some intrinsic sense.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems, I mean, it does seem as though that's really taken off since the advent of the internet, and, the ability for computers to record and reproduce and copy things, and, the open source movement and everything like that. It does seem to, like, over the last 60, 40 years or so, really made a big difference.
So just like you would have been surprised to learn that writing doesn't seem to have accelerated the farming era, you should be surprised to know that computers and the internet didn't really accelerate growth in the industrial era. We are still growing at pretty much the same rate we've grown for the last few centuries. And these apparent revolutions haven't added up to something that really changed the growth rate. So a key thing to know about the last few centuries, or a couple of key things to know, is there have been these bursts of concern about AI and machines taking over that go way back. There was a burst of concerns in the early 1800s when the Industrial Revolution was just going, a burst of concerns around the 1930s, a burst around the 1960s, the late 80s, and a burst more recently. And all through this period, there has been a pretty noticeable rate of job displacement due to technology change. That is, for the last few centuries, technologies have been changing, and that's been changing jobs, and sometimes that makes jobs go away. And other times it just makes particular tasks go away or get changed substantially. And the rate at which this has been happening is relatively steady for a while. So sometimes people say a story of like, the natural thing that happens with computers is this really fast exponential growth. So you should expect slow change until all of a sudden it, boom, happens really fast.
Well, what would that look like? What would classify as happening really fast? I mean, what sort of inventions or ideas, or what would the world look like now if things happened faster than they were? What would convince you that things are happening really fast?
Well, there's a number of different metrics of change. Obviously, the most fundamental one is productivity, our capability to do things that we want to do. And so if computers were really like getting some traction at being able to do things much better than before, then they would be doing a lot, and that would be increasing our productivity. That is, we'd be getting able to do a lot more than we could before. And so productivity measures would be, accelerating and growing faster. And that's not what we've seen so far. Productivity, if anything, has been slowing down the last few decades. And that's a standard topic of debate and discussion. And so other things we'd expect to see, we might expect to see, as part of that productivity process, we'd expect to see a more rapid rate of people displaced off their jobs because that's how productivity would in part happen. Because a thing that a person was doing before at great expense is now being able to be done by a cheap machine at much lower expense, and that's what productivity is. And if people were just seeing this about to come, say it's not quite happening, but people in the trenches see that it's coming, the kind of things you expect to see is a big burst of investment toward the machines and the tools that would be doing this displacement, because they'd be worth a lot of money. And so you'd be seeing, say, tech firms, their stock prices being bid up. You'd be seeing students and employees like specializing and focusing in those areas because they were going, wow, look, this is where all the money's going to be. And there's huge demand here, and we're just jumping on this big opportunity. That's the kind of thing you expect to see. So
well, I mean, people argue that that's what's happening. A lot of people went into app development, in the 2000s, and before that it was software development in general and web development. Right. And now people, there's a rising tide of undergrads moving their way through AI right now.
So in fact, if you look at the history of the share of different industries in terms of stocks, the dot-com boom looks kind of like the thing you'd expect to see. Over a relatively short term, there's this huge burst, boom of investment that went into technology. And at the time it was because people were saying, wow, there's going to be this huge productivity boom in this technology area. Now, of course, the dot-com boom crashed. And while there's been some recent increase in investment in technology, it's much smaller than the dot-com boom. And in fact, though...
But you could argue, like, the dot-com boom was fueled by people's ignorance of what the future might look like. People aren't great predictors.
Oh, of course, right. But the point is that's the kind of thing you should expect to see.
Right. So we'd expect to see some foolish investments followed by, a big learning curve, and then more stable but wise investments in the technologies that are going to make a big difference.
Right. So if people were learning that there was a good chance of a big automation boom soon, then we would expect to see the sort of thing we saw during the dot-com boom, which is a huge amount of investment going into technology areas that would be the things that people would be buying instead of the humans on the jobs. And the point is, at the moment, we see a small degree of that, but not remotely at the level of the dot-com boom, and therefore not remotely at the level of something you could predict. The robots are all taking over jobs soon. We're just not at that level. So it could happen as a surprise in principle, but we're certainly not at the level where investors have a substantial confidence that it's about to happen. That's because we just don't see that.
It does seem as though people have been surprised by innovation in the past. There's I think Oppenheimer, I think just months or years before it was possible to create a nuclear reaction, said that it wouldn't be possible, and or at least within 50 years, or maybe he thought it was never. One of the Wright brothers, this is commonly brought up in less strong discussions, one of the Wright brothers said that heavy in their flight wouldn't be possible, at least for another 50 years, shortly before it was possible. Right. Largely because of what they were doing.
So now we're getting back to the subject of the lumpiness of innovation. So if we look at our whole
difficulty of predicting it, and how surprised people are when it actually does happen.
Well, I mean, the main thing to do is just look at the distribution of lumpiness in the past, and then say, well, the future will probably be like the past, and say, what's the chance of different size lumps? Because in the past, most innovation in the past has been a lot of relatively small innovation, and then every once in a while there have been these bigger lumps. But even something like, say, heavier than air flight, it wasn't a single lump. It was maybe a lumpy demonstration that inspired people, but then a lot of detailed other innovation that has to go on in order to make that actually work and be feasible. So clearly the air industry was something that it wasn't like one air company took over all the airline industry. A lot of different firms could get into that. A lot of different firms offer their different innovations and different approaches. And then the overall air industry grows, but not because of any one air company taking over the whole thing. And so even if air flight was a lumpy thing in the terms of the first demonstration of heavier than air flight, might have been a surprise, and it might have been a lumpy surprise. But that one lumpy innovation isn't at all the same as talking about a lumpy thing that lets you take over all of flight.
Okay, so well, a couple of things that have happened recently in the AI world is that have loomed large on the headlines have been DeepMind's successes in developing AI, training AI to outcompete all human efforts at programming chess programs or Go programs to defeat humans. And more recently, they also won a sort of a protein folding competition, and also have been winning in larger 3D environment games like Dota and StarCraft 2 multiplayer games against champions there, and have sort of also won a lot. And now people are beginning to think, well, most of the challenges which they're sort of approaching, they're being successful with. You and Eliezer Yudkowsky addressed the issue about whether such progress at DeepMind, as an example, whether it was in favor of one side of the argument or not. Obviously, Eliezer Yudkowsky was saying that it was showing weekly, I guess, increasing weekly should increase people's credence that a Foom scenario is more possible. But you didn't see it that way. So do you want to describe why?
So an analogy might be 9/11 as a terrorist attack. So, as most people know, on September 11th, 2001, there was this big terrorist attack, and it was unusually large compared to previous terror attacks over the previous few decades. And so at that point, the key question was, has the distribution of terror attacks changed? Or did we just get an unusual outlier in the distribution of attacks? Because distribution of attacks has a power law, and every once in a while you should expect a really big attack. But when you do see a big thing, you often wonder, is this the beginning of a new trend? This often happens with a big earthquake or something like that too. Any big event that's quite big compared to other recent events, people say, this could be the beginning of a new trend. This might not be, just an unusually large outlier in the previous one. What if it's about to be a lot bigger? People even say that about, say, the 2008 financial crash. Anytime there's an unusually large event, there's some people who will say, well, this isn't just one unusual thing. The regime has changed. We're now in a new world where this sort of thing is going to happen a lot more. Now, usually it's not true. So the distribution of terror attacks post 9/11 isn't really any different than the distribution before 9/11. We haven't had a burst of earthquakes since the last big earthquake. The 2008 financial crash was not a sudden indication of a lot more financial crashes soon. Sometimes regimes change, but the mere fact that you have an unusually large event by itself is not enough. What you'd want to see is more like a sequence of an unusually large events that was unusually large compared to previous sequences. That's more what you'd want to see.
Right. So you don't characterize the series of AIs that DeepMind has created, AlphaGo 0 and the iteration of those, and then the one which beat StarCraft players was that I forget what it's called, Alpha Star. Yeah, Alpha Star or something like that. Yeah.
Alpha Zero, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, well, that was the last of the AlphaGo iterations, wasn't it? AlphaGo 0. And then there was something called, whether it was Alpha Star or something else, I don't remember. That was a different AI which beat the pants of some of the
so I think the key is to have a sense of history. So if you only see the recent demos, it's easy to believe that it's unprecedented. The only way to know if it's actually unprecedented is to see precedents, to see what happened at previous eras. So as I mentioned before, we're now in, burst of concern number 5 out of AI concerns. And in each of the previous bursts, we also had dramatic, unprecedented developments. that people could point to as saying, wow, nobody could ever do something like that before. So in the early 1800s, it was the Industrial Revolution. It was the fact that we were able to make lots of very productive machines that was displacing people on jobs and making an enormous revolution that was really freaking people out. And a lot of the most, famous, smart economists of the time explicitly talked about what happens if the machines take all the jobs. Because look, there was the Industrial Revolution, and that was this unprecedented, spectacular thing that was happening. We again saw a burst of concern in the 1930s. This is when, say, they made the movies like, these futuristic movies about computers, robots taking over. People like Einstein and Keynes actually said that the low unemployment of the 30s was caused by machines taking over, replacing people on jobs. That was a common thing many intellectuals said in the 1930s, that the big unemployment we were seeing there was the direct result of machines displacing jobs. And they were right there seeing the machines displacing people off of all the jobs because of that unemployment. That's what many people were saying in the 1930s. And the 1930s saw this spectacular burst of innovation. New innovations were happening that were quite disruptive at a rate much more than we see today in the 1930s. If you go back and realize all the things that were happening, it was really quite spectacular.
Well, we have the low-hanging fruit. And it could be that, with the right innovations, we'll be creating a new sort of layer where we can sort of scaffold our next level of harvesting.
Oh, sure. My main point is now just to make it clear just how much really big, unprecedented things were happening in each of these bursts of concerns.
Back to the outlier example you brought before with the terrorist attacks. Do you think that this progress in AI recently, with them being able to, be like experts in certain games at a time which way before most experts would have predicted, do you think that they are outliers? And what sorts of progress in the future would you think would disqualify that view of this progress?
So the question isn't so much are they outliers? It's like, how often do you expect to see something that big as an outlier? Is it every, so floods, for example, they talk about the flood you expect to see every 10 years and the flood you expect to see every century, etc. And so it's the flood that you wouldn't have expected to see for a really long time that's an outlier flood. So if you look at the history of computer science over the last 70 years, say, we've had a lot of pretty big dramatic innovations of the scale of DeepMind. It's not a once a century innovation remotely. It's not even a once a 50 years innovation. It's more like a once in 10 years innovation of the sort that we've seen every 10 years for the last 70 years. It's in that sense part of the trajectory that we've had, which is rapid dramatic improvements in computers and computer applications for a while. And I was caught up in the last burst of concern before the current one. See, I was a naive 20-year-old something who read these exciting newspaper articles around 1983, and this was that was the big AI boom then, and it was talking about these dramatic demos that were doing unprecedented things. They were having machines that could diagnose disease as well as doctors. They could organize chips better than humans. They could arrange pipelines. There were all these dramatic demos in the early 1980s of things that machines could do better than humans or as well as humans that were quite difficult and unprecedented. And that was the basis of people claiming that, look, we're just about there in the 1980s. And I left school to go out to Silicon Valley to join the AI revolution then. And I spent 9 years as an AI researcher from 84 to 93. So I have this visceral sense of how it can seem to a naive young person that here are these unprecedented demos and nobody's ever done something like that. And aren't we almost there?
Right. So you imagine Eliezer Yudkowsky and a bunch of others in 2040 will be telling the next generations of young, bright-eyed, enthusiastic people how it's not going to be the AI revolution this time.
Well, they can certainly tell them that whatever they're seeing then might or might not be unprecedented with reference to precedents, actual what's happened before. This is a problem. People often throw out the word unprecedented without actually knowing what precedents there are, without actually knowing what happened before. They look at something and say, well, Just that couldn't possibly be precedented, but yes, it can.
Well, I mean, like it's been asked in some of the chats that I've been in, like watching right now in reference to this interview. Somebody asked, well, what sorts of developments would change your mind, would make you more bullish on the side of this could happen relatively fast?
As an economist, the obvious metric to keep track of is economic growth and productivity. So as I said before, the most direct measure of a big impact of technology, AI technology on the economy is productivity. You know, us being able to produce a lot more than we could before. A slight variation on that is job displacement, people being thrown off their jobs at an unusually high rate compared to before. If you're looking for a bit earlier indicator of those things, then when investors start to notice that those things seem to be like they're about to happen, as I said before, then that's a moment when you should expect to see an enormous burst of investment that goes into the kinds of tools that would and the resources that would be used to produce that kind of automation and productivity boom. So if that's computer firms, if that's computer software firms, AI firms, whoever it is, there would be this enormous burst of investment that went into those things. That would be something you'd see a little earlier. Now, you might say, well, yes, but even earlier to that, you might see some really impressive demos. And you might, but it's much harder to judge impressive demos and what sort of actual economic impact they can have. So, you know, as you might notice, the vast majority of these really impressive demos in the last few years aren't really next to industries with a lot of revenue. You know, there's just not a lot of people that pay to play Go. So winning at Go is just not a big revenue winner. Even protein folding, you know, there's just not a huge industry where you get people to pay you to do protein folding. And so having impressive progress.
Oh, okay, so what about, you know, I mean, self-driving cars, automated checkouts, all sorts of things that are now driven by AI. A lot of these things are actually behind the scenes. You don't actually get obvious manifestations right before your eyes. They're more sort of hidden.
So a recent economics paper did a nice analysis. So over the last decade or two, we've had this slowdown in productivity in the advanced countries. And they said, well, if over the next 20 years, imagine that we saw, you know, the kind of displacement you might have hoped for in self-driving cars and in automated automated phone services, like, you know, help services on the phone. Say you displace 60 or 70% of those jobs in each of those industries over the next 20 years. You'd need 10 more things like that to raise productivity growth up to the level we had it before. That is, just 2 of them by themselves is not remotely enough. You'd need those 2 and 10 more, and that all together might be enough to just increase productivity back to where it was a few decades ago. Not enough to remotely go out of the Industrial Revolution regime, just for the advanced companies to have their productivity growth go back up to the middle of what we've seen in the industrial era. So the point is, these, even if those things happen, they are well within the history of the kind of automation and job displacement we've seen. They are not deviations from trend.
Right. So robotics in assembly lines and sort of 3D printers printing sort of specific things on demand and stuff, you wouldn't see that as out of the ordinary. That's what you'd see that as.
Right. It's about the scale. I mean, so the key point to keep in mind is during the industrial era, the world economy doubles every 15 years. You can't double the world economy unless most industries are going through enormous innovation on a 15-year period, because basically you're doubling everything on a 15-year period. So that means the history of the industrial era is large innovation and large change. That's what it takes to stay within the industrial era. That doesn't pull you out of the industrial era to some much more rapid change. You need a lot of innovation and a lot of big innovation and a lot of disruptive innovation to continue the trend we've seen for the last few centuries.
Okay. Well, okay. So if the trend just continues in the direction it is right now, it doesn't speed up, what sorts of progress do you then see in the next 15 years? Another doubling of the economy?
Right. So the way I see the future is either mostly a continuation of the past trends, or at some point a radical change. And so we've been talking about what would be the signs of a radical change, a radical deviation from past trends. But if we don't have that, we'll probably have a continuation of past trends. So the key things to know is that we've so far been adapted to our past trends. Over the last century, we've handled the doubling every 15 years. We've handled the degree of job displacement that causes, the degree of inequality that causes, the degree of uncertainty it causes, the degree of not being sure how the future is going and what kind of technologies would be important, the ability, the changing and uncertainty about which careers and which industries are important. We've been handling that pretty well. So you should expect the same amount of that in the future as the past. So our past institutions, if they were up to handling that, they should still continue to be up to handling that in the future. There's no particular reason to think we're at a crisis where our current institutions couldn't handle the kind of change that we've already seen for a long time. So you should expect to see the same level as in the past. That is, you aren't quite sure which jobs will be in demand. You're not quite sure which technologies you should learn to be in on the future. You're not quite sure which nations will prosper as a result, which professions even will prosper. There's just a lot of uncertainty about where the future is going. And that's how the world's been for a long time. And that's what you should expect for the next few decades as well, if we continue on the same trend.
Okay, well, let's just narrow down on AI development and AI progress. What do you think will contribute more to jumps in AI capability? Would that be hardware improvements or software improvements? Or something else?
So I'm mostly going to say, what do we know about the past? And guess that the future will be roughly like the past. So in the past, in some areas, it's overwhelmingly software that makes the difference. That is, in some areas, the hardware is plenty fast and cheap enough. And so the limiting factor is making software, and the hardware is just easy. There are other areas where hardware is hard. And in those areas, we actually have this interesting phenomena where the rates of improvement of the hardware are about the same as the rates of the improvement of the software, which is a remarkable coincidence. That is, if the hardware gets a factor of 2 cheaper every 18 months or 2 years, then the software gets a factor of 2 more efficient on the same timescales. That suggests that, in fact, the cause of the software improvement is indirectly the hardware improvement. That is, the world has all these ideas for better software, but you need faster, cheaper hardware to try them out. And so it's the faster, better, cheaper that hardware that lets you try out enough of the software ideas to figure out which ones really work well to actually get the rate of software improvement that we see.
Right.
And so that's I would guess that will continue. That is, in the areas where hardware isn't really a limitation. It's just the software. And once you have the right software, it's cheap and easy. Then it's all about the software. But in many areas, the hardware is a limitation. In which case, you expect a similar rate of improvement in the software and the hardware at roughly the same rates.
It sounds like you were describing the hardware as being the limitation in actually finding the software that might be useful.
Exactly.
It wouldn't actually be a limitation on that software once it was found. Wouldn't necessarily be that it would need huge amounts of hardware to actually run. Once discovered, it could then either be optimized a little further and have a huge amount of hardware overhang and be incredibly powerful.
But again, that's what we've seen for the last 70 years.
Hmm.
We've seen that happen many times. And so we should just expect that to continue in the future, the same sort of phenomena that, sometimes you make a software advance that required the hardware to explore it, but then once you have it, you're able to apply it more broadly because you've made this advance. And that's what we've seen in the past.
Shulman and I think it was Anders Sandberg were exploring this idea of how far away is this sort of fast takeoff, if it is, or the takeoff, forget about whether it's fast or slow. And I think that if it ends up being overwhelmingly that there's hardware, which is a problem, then it may be the case that it will be a slow takeoff because it may only take off as fast as Moore's law increases the hardware ability, or whatever the law is in the future. The increasing hardware efficacy, where if it is software, once the software is found, there may be a huge hardware overhang that can be exploited straight away, and you get huge capability gains in short amounts of time.
Well, that analysis is implicitly assuming a big lumpiness. And so that's the key concept that I've been pushing here as a way to help you think about this. If there's just the one algorithm defined that lets you do all of intelligence, then when you find the one algorithm and there's a hardware overhang, then you have this huge boom. But that's all based on the idea that there's this one thing defined. If there's 1,000 little things defined, each of which plays out that way, then you've got more like the AI services scenario where overall it's a gradual improvement, even if in each of the 1,000 areas there are lumpy advances.
Yes.
And so again, we come back to this key question of the lumpiness of intelligence.
Right. Okay. So if it is that, maybe a lot of the innovations have actually been discovered, but there's just, a little bit more secret sauce in that view, you'd then be sympathetic to a hard takeoff more than you would if you thought that there were lots of little things that still need to be discovered.
Right. So that's why I tried to say at the beginning of our discussion here, which is to say, if you assume this lumpiness about AI innovation, then that predicts that it's plausible that one small villain on an island or small team in a basement could find this one very lumpy innovation and then make enormous progress as a result, and then have this enormous effect on the world, and then enormous dangers as a result of it taking control, that team taking control, or the machine getting out of control of that team. And so if you find that lumpy scenario plausible enough, then you will want people to put effort into focusing on it. And I don't object there being some people focused on that scenario. I just think overall in the world of people thinking about future AI, it looms too large in people's space of possibilities.
Sure. Well, let's look at some of the reasons why people might think that these are high probabilities. It's been argued that when navigating through problem space, one can find a succession of extremely easy to solve problems once you've opened the door, in a sense. So once you've navigated to a certain area, there's a whole space of things to solve in one big heap in probability space, really close to each other. Not evenly distributed out across probability problem space. What do you think of that analysis? What do you think of that?
Again, I mean, I see often people taking the most lumpy innovation events that have ever happened in human history and then saying, see, that could happen again in the future. And I want to say, yes, those happen, but they're part of a distribution and they're a tail of a distribution, and you should know about the rest of the distribution. And so unless you have some particular reason to believe that in this particular case, we will have this unusual tail of the distribution, you should be more expecting to see the whole distribution, not this extremely unusual tail. So, some people like to point to the nuclear weapons and they say, look, nuclear weapons were a very lumpy innovation. Now, actually, it turned out the first nuclear weapons were about as cost effective as TNT in terms of explosive power per dollar put in, because first nuclear weapons were very expensive. But after a while, we got some much more powerful nuclear weapons, and that's what pulled us away from the trend. But the point was, there's a sense in which nuclear weapons were a lumpy innovation. But you got to realize that out of all of human history, you've picked one of the most extreme examples of a lumpy innovation. And so the question is, if that's the 1 in a million or 1 in a billion example, what's the reason to expect that this future thing, which isn't anything like nuclear weapons as far as we know, would be that lumpy?
Okay, I guess, and similarly, the idea that small improvements lead to large capability gains if they're the right ones, not necessarily, opening the door to a big, huge heap of capability or problems to solve to achieve capability gains. Maybe even the right small improvement can actually achieve that. But that's kind of hard to predict. What are your thoughts?
Again, if you just want to say, look, this scenario is possible, I'll say, well, yeah, it's possible. The question is, how likely is it? Not whether it's possible. And to ask how likely it is, we need to look at data in the past. So I think one of the key things that happens is a lot of people near AI or related to the AI, they just don't think past data is relevant. They just think, well, this is a whole new thing. It'll be completely different than anything in the past. And therefore, we just have to go back to really basic priors about what are the range of possibilities. So for example, if we look at growth models, there's a parameter which is the growth rate acceleration. So if you just have a one-dimensional growth model, there's basically two classes of models and one borderline case in between. One class of models is where growth decelerates, where growth slows down because as you grow more, it gets harder to grow. And then there's another class of models where growth accelerates, where as you grow, growth gets easier. The decelerating growth is then less than exponential, more like a power law growth. And the faster than exponential growth typically is reaches a singularity in a finite time. It goes to infinity. Now, if you look at those mathematically, you say, well, my priors are equal across these two. Then you got to say, well, hey, there's a 50-50 chance that we'll go off to infinity in a finite time. And if that's all you know is just the mathematical possibilities, you say, I got to give a lot of probability to that. Now, if I look in history and actual growthing systems, we've almost never seen something go off to infinity in a finite time. All real growing systems in the past, have reached diminishing returns or at most grown exponentially. Very rarely do systems ever grow faster than exponentially. And typically that period of faster than exponential growth runs out quickly and then reaches a period of exponential or less than exponential growth. So we look at actual history of growing systems, we got to say this faster than exponential growth to infinity is not a plausible thing that happens in the world, even though mathematically it's a perfectly reasonable thing to imagine when you think, I know nothing about this world, therefore anything's possible, and I should just look at the mathematics.
But we don't need to see it grow to infinity in order to reach capability gains that sort of outperform humans in most areas of interest. So, I mean, sure, there may be an asymptote like, at 100 times Einstein or something like that. Doesn't mean that, there's going to be a sudden sort of peak to the omega point, you know what I mean? So I don't think it's required that we need to support an argument that says there's going to be infinite growth.
I didn't mean to be suggesting that. I just meant to be saying that's the kind of thing that happens when you say the past experience is irrelevant. I'm just going to think abstractly about the possibilities. Because when you think abstractly about the possibilities, then really lumpy innovations seem plausible, and one company taking over the world is plausible. Because as I've said, in fiction, people have thought that the Bond villain island was plausible, and Marx and Engels thought it was plausible that one firm would take over the capitalist economy. When people don't have a grounding in what's actually happened in the world or how the world works, these things seem very plausible to people. It seems very plausible that there'll be this one lumpy thing that changes everything, because that's the basic story in a lot of science fiction and comic books, is the one villain has the one super thing that threatens everybody and the hero has to go fix it. And of course, we also find it very plausible that if not for heroic regulators or popular opposition, that one firm would have taken over the world by now. And the people with experience and understanding the details say, no, these are not plausible. These do not fit with our history. And then you could say, yeah, but history is irrelevant. So I'm going to go back to my comic book intuitions about what's plausible.
Well, I mean, like, I can see why people may categorize the rise of humanity or humans to, to dominance in the animal kingdom as being a very lumpy example.
Well, that's why but that's why we have the history of these three biggest lumps that have ever happened. And we should analyze what were the causes of those and therefore what future events could be plausibly like them. So each of those three things was a innovation in the rate of diffusion of innovation. That was the key thing in these last three cases. Growth rates became faster because a new way to spread innovation became possible. That's what happened in the last three cases. In none of the cases was it a sudden leap in capability. It was only a leap in the rate of innovation. That was the cases of the three biggest things that have ever happened. So it's fine to imagine then a future event where a rate of innovation happens again. But again, these last three things were relatively broad events encompassing a relatively wide scope, increasing scope over time because the sharing of innovation, the sharing and complementing of innovation has increased over these periods. And so that means you might expect that the next thing that happens will be something that allows a faster rate of innovation, but that also has a lot of sharing and complementing, such that a large scope together takes advantage of this new innovation ability. That would be the straightforward projection of the future based on the last three biggest things that have ever happened. So if you want to go with the biggest lumps ever, I got to say those are them.
Okay, so far we've been talking about the feasibility of it either being a Foom or a slow takeoff. To cap that off, I guess a lot of people think that AI is going to be a powerful thing in the future, and regardless of whether there's been an adequate solution to the question of friendly artificial intelligence, there will be people out there who will just try and create Foom, not knowing whether it's possible or not. Will just do it because they want to be the first. They want to take advantage of a perceived first mover advantage. So kind of scary, and I think we should, in any case, even if we don't know that it's going to be a Foom or a slow takeoff, prepare for the worst. So that I think you agree with that. Like you've already said it.
I have a subtler answer, which is so if the local Foom is coming, if the machine in the basement that takes over the world scenario is plausible and it's coming, then as I said before, you won't expect to get much warning about it. And therefore you'll have to prepare well before you see any indications of its problem. Because it's just this lumpy thing that happens very surprisingly and all of a sudden. If instead you've got this big chunk of the world that grows together in a visible way that you would start to see it happening, well, now you don't necessarily have to prepare well in advance. So now you face the question, when is the right time to prepare? So, there's a number of considerations. So there's three main considerations, I think, here about when to prepare. So one consideration is if you spend money now versus spending money in 15 years, if you spend money in 15 years, you get to spend twice as much money because the economy doubles and your investments double or even more than double. So all else equal, you'd rather wait and spend later because you have more resources. Any dollar you spend now, you can spend $2 later. In 15 years, $4 in 30 years. So that's number one. The second one is how much can you actually in detail envision the systems you have in order to envision the problems they'll have and how to fix them. So if you're too far in advance, you just don't know enough about what you're trying to fix to be very useful about it. Imagine trying to figure out car accidents and highways in the year 1500. And you'd realize, well, that's probably too early. It probably made more sense to see actual cars. And it doesn't mean you have to wait until you've seen 50 years of cars to do anything, but it might mean, you start to see some concrete vision of roughly how big they are, how expensive they are, how fast they go, what they're used for, so that you can start to think usefully about what problems they'll present and how to deal with those. So this consideration also suggests, I think, at the moment, waiting, because at the moment we really know very little about concretely how these systems would be structured and placed and their actual issues. There's just so many different possibilities that working on it now is really against a headwind because you just know so little about them. Now, a third consideration that weighs the other side, perhaps, is an intrinsic delay in the process. If, for example, there's a sequence of things you have to do one after another, and they each take a certain amount of time, then you got to start that process, before the sum of those times so that you can be done by your deadline. So a key question is, in this process of preparing for these sorts of problems, how plausible is it that there are these delay things where you need to say, train a person when they're young and they think about all their life, and then later on they have an insight when they're older, building up a whole lifetime of thought and experience or something. I think most of our data on research says that sort of delay isn't a big thing. Mostly research progress is a function of how many people are in an area, and not necessarily about some intrinsic delay in producing progress, but that would be the main consideration that would weigh the other way. So, I mean, but more generally, you might say, well, even if now isn't the right time, how do we know when the right time is? We'll need somebody tracking the problem to say when the right time is, right? The best person to be tracking is somebody who's actually trying. So, so for example, most companies have research labs that don't necessarily produce research that's beneficial to that company. Often they have researchers to track research elsewhere. One of the main functions of researchers in most private companies is to be an inside source that tells you early on what happened, what's going to happen elsewhere, so that you can get a jump on that. So similarly, somebody ought to be researching the future AI safety problem, just so that there's smart people who would be ready to tell you when there's a problem looming soon.
Well, we have some people already. Is it enough?
Right.
Or do you think it's too much?
Right, but you don't necessarily need a lot for them. If the main function is just to keep a certain level of tracking and readiness for when there's a big burst is needed. But this is true in a lot of different research areas, in areas. So for example, it's been true for a long time that, we weren't ready to do fusion energy. But nevertheless, we had some people working on fusion energy.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the people we might turn to say, hey, is this near? Is it time to put a lot more money into this? And, of course, they're often biased and they'll always tell you it's time for that, but you don't have to believe them. But you want some people tracking that. Some people have long been arguing that we should be doing asteroid mining. That seems kind of crazy to me, but you know what? There should be some people who track that. Some people should be studying asteroid mining at any one time, redoing the numbers, looking for possibilities, because, they're the sort of person who, when it was ready, the time to do asteroid mining, they might be ready to make a case for it. And so that's the strongest argument I would accept, is to say, we're a long way off. Large amounts of money now is just, this isn't the right time to spend large amounts of money, because, money later is worth more. We're not close to, it's not remotely close to this to be about to happen. We don't even understand very well even how this thing will be structured or used. So, but we ought to have a few people tracking.
Mm-hmm. Well, so we've spoken about the feasibility and, how much resources should be focusing on, in your view, and how much resources should be focusing on researching whether this is possible and AI safety concerns. What about the desirability of these scenarios? You've mentioned that it might be a lot easier and many other people too, it might be much more easier to deal with a slow takeoff than fast one.
I actually think, so people often have this intuition that technology happens at one rate and wise, cautious control of technology happens in another rate, and they're worried that the first rate is faster than the second. So many people have said they would just like technology to slow down because they can't figure out how to speed up the wise, thoughtful analysis of technology. So maybe when television was possible, they'd want to have held off on television for a decade or a couple of decades while academics debated the topic of whether television should be distributed to the masses or whether television should not be, right? I just don't think that really works in the sense that, mostly so far in history, nobody's been driving the technology train. We have just not been up to the task of stopping technologies, even if we'd wanted to. We don't have decision-making bodies set up to do that and the authority to make it happen. So I haven't put that much thought into, could we prevent technologies, because it just doesn't look like the sort of thing that happens. But I also think that
there's been examples of nudging the way technology is being used. I mean, like we've got,
they're pretty small.
Mutually assured destruction, which
I'd also just say that our ability to adapt to technology is actually the main limiting factor on the growth of technology. it's not that technology can outrun our ability to adapt to it. It's that technology doesn't happen unless we can adapt to it. That is, for an awful lot of technology, you can see it ahead of time and you can try to distribute it, but it's not until you find a way that pushes it into the world where people can, in fact, adapt to it, that it actually happens. Technology doesn't actually happen until people feel that they can adapt, that they can actually change it, they can actually use it. So the ability of people and other social institutions to adapt to technology is, in fact, typically the main limiting factor on the rate of technology change. If you can, in principle, change the technology, but people can't, in fact, assimilate those changes, they don't happen. They only happen when people can, in fact, assimilate the changes.
Well, let's take an example of nuclear weapons. Is that something that people can adapt to? I mean, in a sense, our policies have adapted. If there were another technology, like maybe some airborne bioengineered virus, it was extremely hard to adapt to. You suggested it just wouldn't be created because
no, it wouldn't. That is, military technologies are used when militaries find it in their interest to use them. Weapons don't get mass produced for military use unless a military thinks it's in their interest to mass produce it because they think it gives them a military advantage. That's the nature of military technology. Now, you might think it's a shame for the world if militaries have better technologies, but that's a different issue. But a military technology doesn't get created unless some military thinks they have an advantage from that. So
right.
That's the.
So, but they think the advantage is relative to the disadvantage of letting the other side develop it first. So if there is a risk in developing technologies that are possibly negative and could be end game technologies, people will still development because they're willing to take the risk because the payoffs for them might be quite high. Like, for instance, people may try and create a super intelligence and just pull the pin and let it explode, hoping that, knowing that it's possibly very dangerous to do that, but if it does work in their favor, they get to be king of the universe or king of the galaxy or whatever. You know what I mean?
Well, again, I think one team making a super intelligence just is a very lumpy scenario that I don't find very plausible. But certainly it's plausible that there are technologies that have hurt people for a while. I mean, the classic example is farming. Many scholars have made a strong case that farming hurt individual farmers for a long time. Individual farmers were poorer, worse nutrition, more war, less travel, more disease,
sedentary,
more domination. Like, per individual, many people have said the farming world was worse per farmer. Now, there were a lot more farmers, but for many people's ethics, that doesn't overturn the idea that, yes, but individual ones were worse off. So you might say, well, maybe the world would have been better having somehow preventing farming. But of course, if you had prevented farming, you would have prevented all the things that follow on after that. And that's a generic fact about whatever you're trying to prevent. You might prevent not only that, but everything that would follow after that, unless you sort of go down a different path. So unless you say, well, we're going to get there eventually, we're just going to go this different path. But if you just block off the paths, then you're blocking off all the things that could follow from there. But the most basic point is just, so far in history, we just haven't had much of the form of collective analysis of technology and deciding to adopt it or not based on some collective analysis. That just hasn't happened much. Mostly for the last, million years, humans have adopted technologies when somebody somewhere liked it, regardless of whether that was an overall benefit for the world. That's just how things have gone for a very long time. And it would actually
pretty
be hard to change that. Say again?
It sounds pretty foreboding. I mean, like if the technologies, are getting more and more powerful, the side effects or the possible spikes of potential power gains could be huge, and they can spike in one direction or the other.
But it's not clear that technology is any more powerful in the relevant senses here. If you look back in history, technology was a pretty big deal all the way through history. Technology changes have made enormous changes on humans and human life in very fundamental ways, some of which were good and some of which were bad, for a very long time. I don't actually see upcoming technologies as being that much different than past technologies in terms of their potential for making people unhappy.
Well, let's take some examples. Like if we could take it for an example, a possible airborne engineered super virus that wipes out people. I mean, what have we seen in the past, technologically speaking, that might sort of compare, or the potential for a nuclear war, where many players are basically responding to each other's attacks.
Well, if you're pointing to a hypothetical future super virus, you're pointing to some extreme hypothetical scenario relative to the actual history we've seen. So I'm focused on the actual history so far, and we don't see a trend in actual history so far toward super destruction relative to the past. So for example, over the last few years, some people have made this claim that one person can hurt more people now than in the past. One, killer or one crazy person can just do more harm. There is no trend like that in the data in terms of an individual harm so far in history, for a very long time, at least. I mean, the invention of guns made a difference, but since then, we are just not seeing that sort of trend. I mean, hypothetically, it could happen, but again, you can always make up these extreme scenarios, almost comic book scenarios, in terms of the extremity of a small group of villains doing extreme harm. But that doesn't mean they are typical scenarios, and that doesn't mean they've actually changed the distribution of what's actually happened.
Well, I mean, so it wouldn't, you'd just have to have one outlier, like one crazy leader just, pressing the red button and launching a few hundred nuclear bombs, whatever. That could make a big difference, don't you think?
But that's always been true. The point is, for a long time,
it has been true, but it just hasn't happened yet.
Okay, but the point is, the world isn't. You could say that there's just this generic problem that we've always had and we should deal with. That's different than saying the future is different than the past. That we're facing a new era of heightened risk or heightened problems. That's the part I'm questioning. But I think it's fine to say, look, it's not obvious technology has always been good in the past, and hey, maybe you want to have some sort of overview process to deal with that. It's a hard problem, but it's not a crazy thing to do. But I just say that's been true for a long time, and it'll continue to be true for a long time. And I mostly think there are a lot of big problems in the world that aren't very well addressed, and you mostly should point to past problems and say, hey, let's fix this problem. Pointing to hypothetical future problems that might be different from past problems, I tend not to buy that sort of argument. I think mostly you're looking at the future problems that are a lot like past problems.
Sure, but it doesn't seem as though it's been for that long we've had the number of nuclear weapons that we have today.
But the ability for mass destruction and war has been around for a while.
Right. Okay. So, but it doesn't seem as though it's on the same scale, and it doesn't seem as though it would have the same fallout as something like a huge nuclear exchange. But look, I think it's important to discuss these things. I don't know how much further we can go with this, but one of the things that somebody brought up, Magnus Winding thinks it's worth talking about the extent to which strong assumptions about Foom scenarios or nuclear exchanges, something like that, animate people's focus on existential risk or AI safety. So yeah, and he thinks that it's a lot more than people realize. Do you believe that he's got a point there? Do you think there's too much focus on Foom scenarios or nuclear exchanges, and does that actually shape the way that they think about the sort of causes to prioritize and sort of things to donate to? And
I'm less persuaded that there's any big change in reality, but I'm quite happy to endorse focusing on the problems that have long been in reality, including existential risk. That is, existential risk is such a terrible thing that even if it's a small probability, lowering that probability by a modest amount is a terribly important thing. So I'm happy to endorse people, but we don't need to exaggerate the probabilities to justify working on it. I think there is this temptation to try to motivate people to be concerned about a problem by exaggerating it. And the problem is that when other people notice you're exaggerating, then they lose trust, and then they don't trust the entire analysis or whether there's a problem worth working on. So I think you just need to be really honest and careful and say, yeah, the chance is modestly low, but still it's well worth dealing with. So, the chance of a worldwide nuclear war is still non-zero. It might be, 1 in 1,000 per year or 1 in 100 per year, but those are still really high probabilities worth reducing. So I definitely think if there's a way you can figure out how to reduce the chance of a worldwide nuclear war, that would be worth doing. I mean, the hard part is that just these things are hard things to do. It's hard to figure out how to reduce the chance of a world war. I've been on the board of directors for this organization called AllFed that's been interested in figuring out how in a, say, nuclear winter scenario, we could actually feed a lot of people and you don't have to have billions of people die. So it's actually mechanically possible to use factories and petroleum and other things we have to make food for people, even if the sun gets blotted out for a year, if we prepare ahead for that. So another...
a lot of dead people still, but still you could keep humanity going.
But the point is you could actually keep most people alive if you set it up right.
Really?
So
Wow.
because we can make food in factories. Mechanically, it's possible to do. We don't need to make food on farms. If we really need food, we can make it in factories.
But we still need supply chains to work.
Right, but you don't necessarily need the entire familiar supply chain to work. But the point is, one approach to dealing with nuclear winter is to try to ask how to survive it rather than how to prevent it. And there are things to do there. To say, yes, we should try to prevent these things, but we should also try to do what we can to survive them if they happen.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I can't disagree with that. I think it's a great idea. Yeah, for sure.
Right. But I do think there's this precious resource of people willing to think seriously about the long term. And I guess, that resource gets spent in various ways. And one of the ways it's spent recently is focused on the most extreme scenarios you can imagine. And again, I'm fine with supporting work to prevent those, but I still think we need a lot of people thinking about the middle of the distribution scenarios, not the most extreme things they can imagine. So I would like more people to be imagining typical futures and trying to work out how they would play out and what we could do about them, because I think we'll most likely live in a typical future. Mm-hmm. The extreme futures are disproportionately worth attending to, but still, we shouldn't let that completely push out the middle of the distribution futures. Well, so my book Age of Empire was about a middle distribution future.
Oh, yeah.
Right. This was just about assume a certain kind of robot and then what typically would happen in that world. I wasn't focused on the most extreme things that could go wrong. Although I think having thought about typical scenarios gives you a better idea of the most extreme things that could go wrong. And I think if you don't have a good idea about typical scenarios, you probably have a pretty poor idea of what the worst things that could happen are. Because you just don't understand what the world looks like.
Sure. But it'd be pretty hard for people during the medieval times to imagine this kind of typical future that we're living in. Or do you think we're not living in a typical future?
I think that in 1500, if somebody had understood the basics of industry, they could have said a lot of interesting things about our world.
Maybe a few people did.
They would have had to understand, the key assumption of technology in terms of machines can make machines, and there's plenty of energy for the machines, and then machines can do many things. And from that, they could have anticipated many things about the industrial world. They would, a lot of details they wouldn't get right, but they would roughly get a lot of basics right in terms of, well, we'd clump together in cities and we'd be factories and we'd make cars, would go around fast, and we'd live in buildings that were artificially heated and lighted. And, they could have understand a lot of the basics of and that we'd be rich. Those are some basic things they could understand about our world. So they wouldn't necessarily be able to predict, nuclear weapons and our mad process for handling that. They could predict there'd be some powerful weapons that would be scary and we'd be dealing with, but they wouldn't know what they were exactly or how to deal with how to prevent them.
They wouldn't have guessed, they wouldn't have guessed how to create a nuclear bomb. They wouldn't have. Would have they guessed it would be able to reach the moon? Or did they actually think that was something it would stand on instead of just a big light in the sky?
I mean, we actually have, say, speculations from Benjamin Franklin, which weren't that crazy about the kinds of technologies would eventually be able to do. We've got, mid 1800s speculations about where technology would go, and a lot of those, got a lot of things right. We've had a lot of reasonable speculation about the basic capabilities that, say, the Industrial Revolution would eventually produce.
Sure.
But
in the past, have these, for the few people that did have pretty good views of the future, were they the ones that were actually informing the leaders of the time, that were guiding nations, that were informing the policies?
So unfortunately, the demand is usually for the most dramatic, scary, or morally tinged forecast, rather than the most realistic forecast, because that's what most animates people, and that's been all the way true. The most emotional energy about the Industrial Revolution, I think, was produced by people who predicted a degree of social regimentation. So people saw the early factories, they saw slave plantations, they saw armies, and they saw a high degree of social regimentation in those worlds. And then they saw the industrial world as that sort of degree of organization and regimentation spread to the whole of society. And that terrified a lot of people. They then imagined futures where, like, we were so regimented, the government or our firms, whatever, the big organizations told us who to marry and when to eat and what jobs to do and when to go to sleep. They imagined these very highly regimented futures, and that was very scary. And there's a sense in which they were right that high degrees of regimentation would in fact be relatively efficient for our world, in the sense that if everybody lived together in dorms, living would be cheaper and food would be cheaper. But they didn't quite think through was that when we got rich, we'd want to spend our wealth on something, and we decided to spend our wealth on not being regimented. And that's why our world isn't quite the dystopia that many thought. Although at work, we are the dystopian creatures that our ancestors feared. We don't quite realize, but at work, we are really quite regimented and quite dominated and quite submissive. And we put up with enormous degrees of ranking and being given orders and being compared to other peoples that most humans through history would not have put up with. That's who we are as industrial people, and people were scared of that ahead of time. But we're okay with that now because that's just limited to work. And when we leave work, we are not the regimented creatures that our ancestors feared.
Interesting. Yeah. So now you've piqued my interest. Have you got a particular vision? I mean, you've already mentioned one in the Age of M. Have you got a normal vision of the future, a typical future that you'd like to expound? I mean, you can talk about ends if you.
Well, we should end soon, but yeah. I'll just outline. I mean, Age of M focuses on a concrete scenario of a certain kind of robot taking over. I've more recently been thinking about what happens when M's have to compete with other kinds of robots. And in some sense, I see that as a more typical future in the sense that it's not obvious, say, that M's are the first kind of AI, but it's obvious that eventually M's are possible. And it's also obvious that eventually other kinds of AI is possible. And so then it seems obvious to me that eventually both kinds will exist. And then the game at that point is which kinds win where. That is in a competitive world. Now, many people who see these various future problems that they're worried about say, this is all terrible if competition continues. So somehow we must find a way to no longer allow a competitive world. We must make a world government, make a singleton, whatever it takes to stop competition, because otherwise competition will destroy everything of value. There are many people who have that imagine, but it seems to me when I think it through that a competitive future world isn't so bad. And in a competitive future world, I actually think human brains as emulations have a decent future competing with other kinds of software. The human brain is this remarkably powerful integrated package. And I don't think other kinds of software will compete with it very well for a long time to come at the things that it's best at. So, we are best at this sort of integrated point of view where we look at a broad scope and take a wide range of considerations to make broad choices. And our brains will probably excel at that compared to other software for a long time to come. We'll mostly automate much narrower scope tasks. So like, as we talked about Drexler's AI services, the direct economic incentives will be mostly to automate particular tasks that are done in the economy. And most of us on the job do relatively narrow tasks. Our minds are capable of being much more general, and that's part of the frustration of living in the modern world, is that we are forager minds built for a forager world, but we live in this world where we must be much more specialized in our job roles. But that means that when we automate to swap out job roles, we'll mostly be swapping out humans for much more specialized narrow automation. And that'll leave humans to do the high level tasks for a long time to come.
Indeed. Wow. Been a very interesting discussion, Robin, as it always is. Is there any other concluding remarks you'd like to make at this point as we wind the interview down?
Well, I guess I'll make a slight complaint or note, which is this AI Foom debate happened a long time ago when not very many people were concerned about AI safety in the future. And at that point, people like Eliezer were eager to get anybody to engage their concerns. And I was happy to be one of those people to engage those concerns at the time. And then over the last 10 years, there has been this boom of interest in AI and boom of concern about AI and a boom of attention to AI risk. But once the AI risk people got validation from high status people who said their problems are not crazy, the conversation about whether the scenario makes sense disappeared. There's been almost no interest in revisiting these AI Foom debates once AI risk became a sexy topic. They basically.
I noticed that too. It's very strange. There hasn't been much other than just a few revisits to this original AI Foom debate.
Right. And I think it's because once their basic premises are validated, they're not so interested in revisiting them. They want to continue on from those premises to do the things that they want to do. So I think it's an understandable human behavior, but it's a interesting feature of intellectual debate discussion to keep in mind for other examples, is that when a field is trying to establish itself, that's the time it's most willing to engage outsiders in critiques of the basics of it. Once it becomes more established, it's not really very interested in that.
Well, what further directions do you think this debate could take?
Well, there's just a lot in any debate. There's just lots of detail to get into further. I very rarely tired of getting into the detail of debates on any important topic. So if a topic's important enough, it's well worth just going over the basics more carefully, a little more slowly, making sure you're more precise about definitions, more, detailed about itemizing scenarios. There's just always a lot more work you could do. And, if the question's important enough, that work's worth doing.
Fantastic. And I certainly agree with you there, Robin, for sure. Look, it's been wonderful, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this. And if any of the viewers have also enjoyed this, consider subscribing and liking this video. But also check out Robin's blog, Overcoming Bias, and there's a whole heap of links there to other work that he's done. And there's 2 books. that he's got. We've got the age of M up there at the front, and in the background we've got the elephant in the brain. And I should supply a couple of links to the interviews we've done about those particular subjects in the past. So thank you very much.
It's been great talking. Take care.